Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I hope you can hear me this time.
I can.
Good.
Loud and clear.
Okay, I just want to ask one clarifying question about JobKeeper before moving on to some other matters, because I think there's been a bit of confusion about this. But I'm right in saying that an organisation can apply and qualify for JobKeeper at any point between now and up until the legislated end of the scheme in September. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, good. Moving on to other matters, I'm also interested in the early access to super policy, and in particular some advice which is being given to super fund members about the impact of accessing their funds at this stage. You may or may not be familiar with a media release issued by Industry Super Australia on the 24th of March. It's entitled "Accessing Super Should Be a Last Resort." And in that media release, they attached some analysis performed by ISA about what the effect of withdrawing superannuation would be on their balance at retirement. It has a table, it has a number of different ages and assumptions about how much super they take out. Just to highlight one example, they say if you're aged 30 and you take $20,000 out, the difference at retirement will be you'll have $97,214 fewer dollars. Now, I compared the figures offered by ISA in their advice to the Money Smart website operated by ASIC, and there's a fairly significant discrepancy in the results that it gives. So if you enter the exact same scenario into the Money Smart website, age 30, withdraw $20,000, ASIC advises that you only would have $43,032 less at retirement. So half of what ISA was forecasting. Ms Wilkinson, as a starting point, are you familiar with ISA's analysis?
So I am broadly aware of ISA's analysis, but Mr Jeremenko, who's joined the table, I think has looked at it in more detail than I have.
Okay, well, we'll go to him then. Thank you.
Thank you. So Robert Jeremenko, Division Head, Retirement Income Policy. I've certainly seen the headline takeouts from that ISA analysis. You're correct, Senator, that the number used or the numbers used are very different from the ASIC Money Smart calculator numbers for the same scenarios. And the major reason for that is the use of nominal figures rather than real. So those figures that ISA quote do not take into account, well, do not use today's dollars, effectively. And that is inconsistent with what ASIC has told super funds, what ASIC has told anyone who is making public statements about the effect on retirement balances of various withdrawals from super. So it makes sort of intuitive sense to me that you use today's dollars when you're trying to estimate, which is what the ASIC Money Smart calculator does, when you're trying to estimate what effect a withdrawal will have at some point in the future. So as you say, that figure for the 20,000 withdrawal for a 30-year-old is 43,000 at age 67, not something significantly larger.
Thank you for that answer, Mr Jeremenko. I mean, from an economics point of view, what is the advantages of using nominal figures? Why would you use a nominal figure instead of a real figure?
Well, certainly in that example, the nominal figure gives a larger hit to retirement balances. Now, those who are using that are the only ones that can answer why they are doing that. But what I can point to is that not only, as I've mentioned already, the guidance that ASIC has put out in the public domain and has been out there since before the COVID situation, but also the Actuaries Institute, the general and well-respected methodology for predicting the time value of money is to take into account, an inflation adjustment, so a CPI adjustment and a rising cost of community living standards adjustment, and to do that using real numbers, as in today's dollars, is an appropriate way to give an indication of the time value of money.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Jeremenko. It's probably not your role to speculate what ISA's motives might have been in seeking to dramatically inflate the impact of taking money out of your super fund. Perhaps I will pursue that further with ASIC at a later opportunity. Turning now to some comments Dr. Kennedy has made in his opening statement and throughout the hearing in response to questions about the cost of the restrictions, the health measures that have been put in place on the economy. I notice in answer to Senator Patrick's question, Treasury seem to be indicating they don't have any modelling on the cost of those restrictions. Is my understanding right there?
So we have looked at various scenarios over time and provided advice through this period on quite a few different matters, as I mentioned when I was talking to Senator Patrick.
Right, so are you able to put some kind of either dollar or percentage figure on the impact on GDP of the restrictions that are in place, or under different scenarios of those restrictions, if at different stages of those restrictions?
So we provide advice to the government, and at this stage the government has not provided a GDP estimate. The government has outlined an expected increase in the unemployment rate, where we expect the unemployment rate to rise to 10% in the June quarter, which is 5 basis points less than would have been the case if JobKeeper policy hadn't been put in place. That's the information that's in the public domain at this time.
Yeah, thank you. The reason why...
Anyway, no interjecting.
To assist you as to why I'm asking these questions is that, of course, hopefully, touch wood, we are now turning from a stage where we were increasing the restrictions, National Cabinet and state governments were increasing the restrictions, to one where we are starting to relax those restrictions. And in National Cabinet, and in the interests of all the people who depend on it, in making those decisions, I think it would be very helpful to know which of those restrictions are having the biggest economic impact, and therefore which are the ones that if you remove them would have the biggest economic benefit. So is there anything in Treasury's analysis that can point to the sorts of restrictions that we could lift that would have the biggest economic boost?
So the restrictions, the health restrictions are there for a reason, to reduce the spread of the virus. They are targeted at activities that have people-to-people connection. And you can think about a trade-off in some ways between the health restrictions and the impact on the economy. It is the case that some of our largest industry sectors continue to remain open through this period. Dr. Kennedy mentioned mining, which is around 10%, manufacturing, which is about 6%, and construction, which is about 8%. Some of our other large sectors are also open, such as our healthcare system. So there is, at a high level, you can look at the industry sectors and the share of their economy, but there is an analysis that the National Cabinet is going through and thinking about, which is what are the social distancing measures that are required to maintain control of the virus, and matching that against what are the economic benefits of allowing different activities to resume if they have been paused, and what confidence measures can you put in place in order for people to have confidence to go about activities once restrictions are lifted. And so we are providing a range of analysis.
Sorry to jump in because my time's very limited. I might give you some specific examples and you can see if you can assist me. I've seen in the media today, for example, that some business groups are advocating lifting as soon as possible the domestic travel restrictions that we have in place between states. Does Treasury have any analysis of the cost of maintaining those domestic travel restrictions?
So we, as I mentioned, we do a range of analysis and we provide that to government. So I'm not in a position to provide that to the committee today.
Ms Quinn, the committee is asking for that information. So I think that's the point.
And you have to advance the public interest immunity if you don't want to give it to us.
So the accommodation and food services sector is 2.5% of the Australian economy. And the transport, postal warehouse is 5% of the Australian economy. But we have seen an awful lot of the transport, postal and warehousing continue. So somewhere in there between the food services, accommodation and the transport, that's the rough size of those sectors for the Australian economy. So that's it's not that complicated to think about what the share of the economy is and what activity is allowed. It's a fairly direct translation immediately if everybody was confident to go back and travel. So there will be an issue that raising some of the social distancing measures, you still have to have confidence in terms of consumer confidence and business confidence to carry on activities once the restrictions are lifted. So there's partly a two-step process. One, the restrictions being lifted, and two, activity being resumed by individuals or businesses.
Moving on to another example, the advice from the AHPPC has been very clear that it's safe for schools to be open. What sort of economic impact does it have, parents not being able to send their children to school, and therefore, if parents are able to send their children back to school again, what economic benefits could come as a result?
So to the extent that parents are required to stay home to look after their children, don't have alternative arrangements in place, that's a withdrawal of labour supply from the Australian economy. How large or small that impact is depends on how much people can adjust their work arrangements to work from home. But there is a direct link between people withdrawing their labour supply and directing it towards homeschooling, and that does have a negative impact on economic activity.
And is there any attempt to quantify that negative impact?
We have looked at a range of scenarios, yes, and I'm very happy to take on notice. We have some analysis from the HILDA survey information, but also from the census about how many parents there are that may be impacted by various measures, and I'm very happy to take those details on notice.
Thank you, Ms Quinn.
That will be helpful, thank you. Moving on to another topic, can the department share any red tape reduction measures that have been taken by government already during this crisis? And I include decisions of government as well as decisions by agencies like ASIC and APRA and other regulators.
Just having a changing of the witness, Senator Paterson.
Thank you.
This will be your almost final question.
Thank you.
Senator James Kelly, Acting Deputy Secretary, Markets Group. So I'll focus largely on the Treasury portfolio. As Wilkins already referred, changes being made, say, in the workplace relations space and wherever kind of other reliefs provided in other sectors by other parts of government. And I think you split the answer in terms of what the government itself has done directly and then what agencies, particularly in the Treasury portfolio, have done. So if we look at the government, there have been a range of things done around insolvency issues and bankruptcy proceedings, so increases in the thresholds at which creditors can make demands on debtors and longer times for the debtors to respond to those demands. Temporary relief of directors trading while temporarily insolvent, while trading while insolvent. Importantly, within the kind of credit lending space, a number of steps have been taken. So one of those was to relax or remove the responsible lending obligations for a 6-month period in respect of loans made to a small business, even where that loan was not predominantly for the purposes of to be used for business purposes. Previously, the test was that the relief was only provided where it was predominantly for use for business purposes. The AFCA authorisation conditions have also been adjusted so that decisions made by banks as to whether to provide repayment holidays or whether to provide loans under the SME guarantee scheme are also not subject to AFCA consideration, though AFCA consideration will continue to cover other aspects of those arrangements. So there's some of the things the government itself has done. If we turn to the regulators within the Treasury portfolio, I think it's generally true to say that ASIC, APRA, ACCC have taken a number of steps to push back inquiries or consultation processes or to defer the start of new guidelines or standards. With ASIC, it's also taken a number of steps in relation to advice. So it made a number of changes to allow better access to advice in respect of the early release of superannuation, whether by relaxing the statement of advice obligations on financial advisors or allowing tax agents under certain conditions to also provide advice without a licence, or allowing intra-fund advice to be provided in a greater range of circumstances.
Mr. Kelly, is there much more detail, and perhaps it could be provided to the committee?
I'll just focus on the highlights if you like. I think another important area where relief has been provided by ASIC and the ASX has been in respect of making it easier for equity raisings to take place. That's an important part of the response of the capital markets to the crisis and allowing companies to raise equity. APRA has made a number of important changes, or kind of announced a number of important kind of guidance around the ability for the banks to draw on the capital buffers that they created in becoming unquestionably strong following the financial crisis. So that's an important step to support bank lending to the economy. It's also provided guidance to the banks that allowed the repayment holidays that the banks provided to take place. And probably just on ACCC, and the last example I'd give is an important function the ACCC has done is to provide very fast and effective authorisation to the various sectors and groups of firms to allow them to have some of the discussions they needed to have between themselves and with regulators and government as to how to respond to issues rising from the crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. I'm going to leave you there, Senator Paterson, and go back